Cordelia Whitmore stood alone on the Silver Creek platform as the fifth man this month took one look at her and walked away. The autumn wind carried whispers from the crowd like scattered leaves. Too old to marry. 40 years and past her time. The words settled into her bones. Her carpet bag felt heavier with each rejection. The leather handle had worn smooth under her grip, polished by desperation and diminishing hope. Around her, younger women stepped into waiting arms. Their laughter cut through the thin mountain air. The station master shook his graying head. His eyes held the kind of pity that made her stomach turn. She had seen that look before. In Boston, when the school board delivered the news. When her late husband's business partner disappeared with her savings. When the landlord demanded payment. She could not give. Ruby Sweetwater giggled as her intended swept her toward a waiting buggy. 22 years old with golden hair that caught the late afternoon sun. The crowd cheered their union. Someone muttered about dried-up old maids. The words found their mark. Cora sank onto her trunk. The train that brought her here had already disappeared around the mountain bend. The next eastbound would not arrive for 3 days. 3 days she could not afford. Her purse held exactly $4.37. She had sold everything of value in Boston. Her mother's china, her father's books, the wedding ring that had promised security but delivered only sorrow. Mail-order marriage had been her final gamble. A desperate woman's last play against an unforgiving world. The depot began to empty. Couples departed in wagons and on horseback, the lucky ones who had found what they came seeking. Cora remained on her trunk like forgotten cargo. The mountains watched with indifferent faces carved from stone and time. A shadow fell across her worn boots. She looked up to find weathered hands extending a telegram. The fingers bore calluses and old scars. Working hands that knew honest labor. The man attached to those hands stood tall despite the weight he carried in his shoulders. His face had been carved by wind and worry. Gray touched his temples. Lines mapped the territory around his eyes. This was Ezekiel Thornfield. He had written to her in careful script. His letters spoke of cattle and land, of a daughter who needed guidance and a ranch that required order. He had not withdrawn his offer when she confessed her age. She had wondered why. Now she understood. He carried his own burdens, his own losses. The way he stood spoke of a man who had learned that youth was not the only currency of worth. She rose from her trunk. Her legs felt unsteady after the long journey and longer humiliation. He waited while she found her balance. No rush, no impatience. Just quiet acknowledgement of what she needed to gather herself. The telegram bore her name in his familiar handwriting. Below it, a simple message. I have come as promised. His word had been his bond. In a world that had shown her little constancy, this steadiness felt like solid ground. The wagon ride to his ranch passed in comfortable silence. The road wound through valleys painted in autumn gold. Aspen leaves shimmered like coins in the dying light. The air carried the scent of coming winter and wood smoke from distant cabins. His ranch spread across a natural bowl in the foothills. Cattle dotted the pastures like dark stones scattered by some giant hand. The house stood solid against the mountain backdrop. 2 stories of weathered wood and honest construction. Not grand but enduring. Smoke rose from the chimney. Lamplight glowed in the windows. After months of uncertainty, the sight of home stirred something in her chest she had thought buried with her husband. He helped her down from the wagon. His touch was brief but steady, respectful of her dignity while acknowledging her need for assistance. The small gesture spoke volumes about the man he might be. The front door opened before they reached it. A girl emerged onto the porch. 16 years old with her father's. Stubborn jaw and eyes that held too much knowledge for her age. This was Temperance Thornfield. Cora had heard about her in the letters. A daughter who had lost her mother and trusted few replacements. The girl looked Cora up and down with measuring eyes. Her verdict came swift and cutting. Finally found. Someone desperate enough to take you, Pa. The words hit their target. Cora felt the familiar sting of rejection. But she also heard something else beneath the hostility. Fear. This girl was protecting something precious. Her father. Her home. Her fragile world. Before Cora could respond, horses approached at speed. 3 riders emerged from the gathering. Dusk. The lead rider was a woman who sat her horse like she owned the territory beneath its hooves. Young and beautiful in the way that opened doors and commanded attention. Magnolia Fairweather dismounted with practiced grace. Her dress was Eastern fashion adapted for Western display. Her smile held all the confidence of someone who had never been told she was too old for anything. She swept past Cora as if she were part of the landscape. Her attention fixed entirely on Ezekiel. I heard you had a visitor arriving. Thought I should come welcome her properly. The way she said welcome suggested something else entirely. This was a claim being staked, territory being marked. Cora recognized the challenge even if she did not yet understand her place in it. Ezekiel stepped closer to Cora, not possessive, but protective, making clear where his loyalty lay. Miss Whitmore, this is Magnolia Fairweather. Her father owns the bank in town. Magnolia's smile never wavered. Her eyes measured Cora like a banker might assess collateral, finding the sum insufficient. How lovely to meet you. I do hope you find our little community welcoming. The words carried thorns beneath their sweetness. Cora had faced such women before. Those who wielded beauty and youth like weapons, who saw older women as threats to be neutralized or dismissed entirely. But Cora had learned something in her 40 years. She had discovered her own worth in classrooms full of restless children, in ledgers that balanced under her careful attention, in the quiet strength that came from surviving loss and standing again. She met Magnolia's gaze directly. Thank you, Miss Fairweather. I look forward to making myself useful here. The word useful hung between them. It was not the answer Magnolia expected. Not the defensive response of a woman ashamed of her age. It was a statement of intent. A declaration of purpose that had nothing to do with youth or beauty and everything to do with substance. The ranch books sprawled across Ezekiel's desk like fallen leaves after a storm. Numbers scattered without pattern or purpose. Cora ran her finger down columns that made no sense. Cattle sold, but not recorded. Feed purchased. Twice in 1 week. Money flowing out with no clear destination. She had risen before dawn to examine the ledgers. The kitchen was still dark when she lit the lamp and spread the papers across the table. Years of teaching had trained her to find order in chaos. Children's minds were not so different from neglected accounts. Both required patience and systematic attention. By sunrise, she'd identified 17 discrepancies. By noon, she had traced a pattern that made her stomach tighten. Someone was stealing from Ezekiel Thornfield. The theft was subtle but persistent. Death by 1,000 small cuts. Temperance appeared in the doorway. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders. Sleep had softened the hard edges of her face. For a moment, she looked like the child she had been before loss taught her to armor herself in anger. You fixing to reorganize everything? Cora looked up from the ledgers. Your father is losing money. Someone who knows his business is taking it. The girl's face hardened again, trust withdrawn behind familiar walls. Maybe you should mind your own affairs. This is my affair now. The words surprised them both. Cora had not planned to claim such territory, but the ranch had begun to feel like something worth defending. The books represented more than numbers. They were the foundation of everything Ezekiel had built. Temperance studied her with measuring eyes. You planning to stay then? I am planning to be useful. The girl nodded slowly. Something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance, but recognition. She understood the language of practical value. It was safer than the vocabulary of affection. 3 days later, Cora rode with Ezekiel to check the northern pasture. The mare beneath her was gentle and patient. She had not ridden in years, but her body remembered the rhythm. The mountains held them in a bowl of golden light. They found the heifer in distress near the creek, first birth and struggling. The calf was positioned wrong. Ezekiel rolled up his sleeves and waded into the muddy water. His hands worked with practiced gentleness. Cora held the heifer's head. Her voice was steady and low, calming sounds that had once soothed frightened children. The animal's eyes rolled with panic and pain, but she responded to the quiet authority. In Cora's touch, the calf came in a rush of water and blood. Ezekiel caught the slippery weight and cleared its airways. The first breath was a miracle they had earned together. The heifer began to clean her baby with rough devotion. They sat on the creek bank afterward. Their clothes were stained with mud and birth. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold. Neither spoke of what they had shared, the partnership that had emerged without discussion or negotiation. Ezekiel's hands were still dirty from the birthing, strong hands marked by years of honest labor. Cora found herself studying the scars and calluses. Each mark told a story of work and sacrifice. These were hands that built rather than destroyed. He caught her looking and smiled. The expression transformed his weathered face, revealed the younger man who lived beneath the accumulated weight of responsibility. Her heart performed some small betrayal in her chest. That evening she helped Temperance with her mathematics. The girl was clever, but had been allowed to drift. Her mind needed direction the way the ranch books had needed organization. Structure was not restriction. It was the framework that allowed growth. Why did you never have children? The question came without warning. Temperance's pencil paused over her slate. Her eyes remained fixed on the numbers. Cora considered several answers. All of them true, none of them complete. I taught other people's children instead. But you wanted them? I wanted many things. That did not come to pass. Temperance looked up then. Her young face was serious. Papa says wanting something and needing it are different things. Your father is a wise man. He needs someone who won't run when things get hard. The words hung in the air between them, an offering disguised as an observation. The girl was extending something fragile and precious, the possibility of trust. 2 more cattle disappeared that week. Ezekiel found the tracks leading toward the railroad construction site. The new spur line carved a wound through the valley. Progress that brought prosperity to some and displacement to others. Cora studied the maps in the evening. The railroad's proposed route would increase the value of certain properties dramatically. Land that was currently grazing ground would become prime real estate. Someone stood to profit handsomely from the rancher's losses. Magnolia Fairweather visited again on Sunday. She arrived with a basket of preserves and a dress that displayed her advantages to their best effect. Youth and beauty arranged for maximum impact. She found Cora in the garden, pulling weeds from between the late tomatoes. The work had stained her hands green and brown. Her dress was practical rather than pretty. She looked like what she was, a woman who understood the value of labor. How domestic you are. Magnolia's voice carried the subtle poison of forced sweetness. She stood carefully away from the dirt. Her pale hands had never been stained by honest work. Cora continued weeding. The rhythm was soothing. Each weed removed made space for something better to grow. The garden produces what it is tended to produce, I suppose, though some things grow naturally beautiful without such effort. The younger woman's meaning was clear. Beauty was a gift that required no cultivation. Age was a theft that no amount of effort could recover. The old arguments. Dressed in new clothes, Cora sat back on her heels. Her hands were dirty, but her gaze was steady. Beautiful things that require no tending rarely survive the first hard frost. That night, she heard Ezekiel talking to his foreman on the porch. Their voices carried through the thin walls. The words were fragments, but the meaning was clear. The rustling was organized, professional, someone with knowledge of the rancher's movements and financial situations. "I need this marriage to work, Tom. Can't afford to lose everything now." The words hit her like a physical blow. She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. The wall she had begun to lower snapped back into place. The partnership she had imagined was necessity dressed as choice. She was 40 years old and too desperate to see clearly. He was a man facing financial ruin who needed practical help. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. She was useful. Nothing more. The next morning, she began packing her few possessions. The eastbound train would arrive on Thursday. She had enough money for passage if she ate carefully and found work quickly. Upon arrival, Boston held no welcome for her, but neither did this place where she had allowed herself to hope. Temperance found her folding her second dress. The girl stood in the doorway like an accusation. Her young face was pale with understanding. You heard him talking to Tom. Cora's hands stilled on the worn fabric. Your father is a good man facing difficult circumstances. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. It does not matter what he meant. It matters to me. The girl's voice cracked with emotion held too long in check. She had begun to care for this woman who brought order to chaos, who saw her as more than a burden or a disappointment. The possibility of loss was opening old wounds. Cora looked at the child who was trying so hard to be grown. Temperance had lost her mother and could not bear to lose another woman who might fill that hollow space. But love built on necessity was no foundation for a life. You will be fine. You are stronger than you know. I don't want to be strong. I want you to stay. The naked honesty in those words nearly broke Cora's resolve. But she had learned the cost of misplaced hope. Better to leave with dignity than be asked to go when her usefulness ended. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold. The first snow dusted the peaks like premature age. Winter was coming whether they were ready or not. Cora carried her carpet bag to the wagon. The same bag that had held all her hopes 3 weeks ago. Ezekiel found her loading her trunk. His face was carved from stone and regret. He had lost something precious through careless words and masculine pride. The recognition came too late to matter. Don't go. 2 words that carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. But words were just sounds in the cold morning air. Actions had already spoken louder than any plea could manage. The train whistle echoed across the valley, a lonesome sound that called the lost and displaced. Cora had answered that call before. She could answer it again. Survival was a skill she had mastered through hard necessity. The wagon wheels cut deep ruts in the frozen mud. Each turn brought them closer to town and the eastbound train that would carry Cora away from everything she had briefly allowed herself to claim. Ezekiel sat rigid beside her, his hands tight on the reins. The horses sensed the tension and stepped nervously. Behind them, the ranch grew smaller in the gray morning light. Smoke still rose from the chimney. The cattle still dotted the pastures. Life would continue without her as it had before she arrived. The thought should have brought comfort. Instead, it felt like erasure. You think I'm a fool. His voice cut through the silence between them. The words were rough with emotion held too long in check. She did not answer because the truth would serve no purpose. They were both fools in different ways. I said those words to Tom because I was scared. He pulled the wagon to a stop beside the creek where they had delivered the calf together, where they had been partners in something pure and necessary. Scared of losing the ranch. Scared of failing Temperance. Scared of caring too much about someone who might leave. The water ran clear over stones worn smooth by time and current. Some things endured. Others were swept away by forces beyond their control. She understood which category she belonged to. You need someone who can help you save what you built. Her hands were folded in her lap, still and proper. The pose of a woman who had learned to contain herself. That is not wrong. It is practical. I don't want practical, I want you. The words hung in the cold air between them. Too late and too raw. She had learned not to trust such declarations when they came wrapped in desperation. Men said many things when they faced loss. Few meant them when the crisis passed. They reached town as the morning train pulled into the station. Steam rose from the engine in white clouds that dissipated in the mountain air. Passengers gathered their belongings and stepped down onto the platform. The fortunate ones who had places to go and people who wanted them. Cora climbed down from the wagon. Without assistance. Her independence was armor against the pitying looks that would come. The spinster who had tried to find love and failed. The cautionary tale other women would whisper about. The station master recognized her. His eyes held the same sympathy she had seen 3 weeks ago. Some stories repeated themselves with depressing regularity. Hope followed by disappointment. Followed by resignation. She purchased her ticket with careful precision. The numbers in her purse had been counted and recounted. Enough for passage and perhaps a week of meals if she was careful. After that, she would rely on whatever Providence and her own skills could provide. Ezekiel stood beside the wagon, watching her navigate the familiar ritual of departure. His face was stone-carved by wind and regret. He had ridden to town to stop her from leaving, but words had failed him when they mattered most. Now he could only witness her choice. The train whistle called its warning. 15 minutes until departure. Cora found a bench near the platform edge and arranged her skirts around her carpet bag. The same bag that had carried her hopes from Boston. Now it held only the practical necessities of a woman with uncertain prospects. Temperance appeared at the station door. The girl had ridden hard to reach town before the train departed. Her horse was lathered with sweat and effort. Her face was flushed with more than just the cold wind. She approached Cora with the careful steps of someone walking on thin ice. Her young face was set in lines too old for her years. She had practiced this conversation during the desperate ride to town. I lied to you. The words came out in a rush. Guilt and desperation making her voice shake. About what Pa said. About him wanting a broodmare. He never said that. He said he needed someone strong enough to be a real partner. Cora felt something crack inside her chest. The careful walls she had built around her heart showed there first. Fissures, why did you lie? Because I was scared you'd take him away from me. Tears cut tracks through the dust on the girl's cheeks, like Ma did when she died. I thought if I made you leave, nothing would change. The train whistle blew. Again, 10 minutes. Passengers began gathering their belongings and moving toward the cars. The rhythm of arrival and departure that governed all their lives. But everything changed anyway. Temperance wiped her nose with the back of her hand. The house feels empty without you fixing things. Pa walks around like he lost something important. And I miss having someone who sees me as more than just a burden. The girl's honesty was a blade that cut through all of Cora's careful reasoning. She had built her departure on the foundation of being unwanted. Now the foundation was crumbling beneath the weight of truth. I heard him talking about the marriage needing to work. Because he loves you and doesn't want to mess it up. Temperance's voice rose with frustration. He's never had to court a woman who was his equal before. Ma was young and needed taking care of. You're different. You scare him. 5 minutes. The station master was calling for final boarding. Cora stood and lifted her carpet bag. The weight of it seemed to have doubled in the past few minutes. Or perhaps she had simply grown weaker. A commotion at the far end of the platform drew her attention. 3 riders had arrived at speed. Their horses were breathing hard and their faces were grim with purpose. She recognized Tom, Ezekiel's foreman. The other two men wore badges that caught the morning light. Tom strode toward Ezekiel with the urgency of a man carrying bad news. Their conversation was brief and intense. Ezekiel's face went white beneath his weathered tan. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Temperance was gone. The words reached Cora across the platform noise. The girl had ridden to town to stop the train, but she had not ridden alone. Someone had followed her. Someone had been watching and waiting for the right moment. The train was moving now, pulling away from the station with a grinding of metal on metal. Cora's ticket was still clutched in her hand, her passage to safety and a new start. But she could not board a train when a child was in danger. She walked toward the group of men with steady steps. Her carpet bag remained on the platform bench. For the first time in weeks, she was not carrying all her possessions with her. She was leaving something behind by choice rather than necessity. How long has she been missing? Ezekiel looked at her with eyes that held too much fear and too little hope. Since dawn. Her horse came back without her. No sign of where she went. The rustlers? Tom nodded grimly. Had to be. They've been watching the ranch, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Cora's mind was already working through the possibilities. The patterns she had seen in the account books. The systematic nature of the thefts. This was not random violence. It was business conducted by other means. They will want to negotiate. The men looked at her with surprise. A woman was not expected to understand such matters. But she had spent 20 years managing children who tested boundaries and pushed limits. Human nature was consistent regardless of age. They need something from you, she continued. Otherwise they would have simply taken more cattle. Taking Temperance is a message. A rider approached from the north road. Magnolia Fairweather sat her horse with unusual tension. Her perfect composure was cracked around the edges. She dismounted and walked toward them with quick, nervous steps. I need to speak with you. She looked directly at Cora, ignoring the men entirely. About my father, about what he's been doing. The words fell into the morning air with the weight of stones. Dropped into still water. Ripples of understanding spread outward from the impact. Banker Fairweather had access to financial information about every rancher in the valley. He knew who was vulnerable and when. He's been working with them. Magnolia's voice was barely above a whisper. The railroad men. Telling them which ranchers to target and when. Ezekiel stepped toward her with murder in his eyes. Tom's hand moved to his gun. But Cora held up her hand for silence. The girl was frightened enough without adding to her terror. Where is Temperance? The old mining camp up Copper Creek. They're planning to force the sale of your ranch in exchange for her safety. Magnolia's face was pale with shame and fear. I came to warn you because I've been terrible to Miss Whitmore. She has everything. I thought I wanted purpose, respect, your love. The word hung between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross. Love, not convenience or necessity or practical arrangement. The thing that made all the difference and none of the difference. I know where the camp is, Tom said. But they'll be watching. The approaches. Cora looked at the faces around her. Men prepared for violence, a girl seeking redemption. A community under siege from forces that saw only profit where others saw home. Then we don't approach, she said quietly. We make them. Come to us. Cora spread the ranch ledgers across the sheriff's desk with the precision of a general deploying troops. Numbers told stories that men with guns could not extract through force. 20 years of teaching had shown her that knowledge was the strongest weapon. Here, her finger traced the pattern she had discovered weeks ago. Every theft corresponds to a loan payment or property tax deadline. Someone knew exactly when each rancher was most vulnerable. Sheriff Morrison studied the columns with growing understanding. His weathered face hardened as the implications became clear. Fairweather had access to all this information. Magnolia stood near the window, her perfect composure finally cracked. Beyond repair. My father kept files on every rancher in the valley. Their debts, their assets, their weaknesses. I thought it was just good business. It was business, Cora said quietly, just not the kind your father claimed to practice. The plan she outlined was born from classroom management and maternal instinct. Children who misbehaved responded to structure and consequences. Men who preyed on the vulnerable were simply larger children who had never learned limits. Tom and the other ranch hands would position themselves around the mining camp, not to attack, but to contain. Meanwhile, Cora would walk into the camp, alone, carrying what appeared to be the deed to Ezekiel's ranch, surrender disguised as negotiation. "You're not going up there alone." Ezekiel's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. But authority was useless against a woman who had made her decision. "I am going because they will not expect it." She folded the papers with careful precision. "Men who steal from women and children do not anticipate being confronted by their victims." The ride to Copper Creek took 2 hours through terrain that climbed toward the tree line. Ancient pines stood sentinel over ground that had been torn and scarred by mining operations. The earth here had been wounded in the name of progress. Cora rode alone, as planned. Behind her, hidden among the rocks and trees, Tom and his men moved into position. The sheriff had stayed in town to arrest banker Fairweather. Justice would be served from multiple directions. The mining camp squatted in a hollow between two ridges. Abandoned buildings sagged under the weight of mountain winters and broken dreams. Smoke rose from one cabin, revealing where the kidnappers had made their temporary home. She dismounted 50 yards from the cabin and walked the remaining distance on foot. Her hands were empty except for the folded papers. No weapons, no threats. Just a 40-year-old woman who had learned that dignity was its own form of armor. Cornelius Blackwood emerged from the cabin as she approached. Railroad money had bought him fine clothes and expensive boots, but it could not purchase the kind of presence that came from honest work. He looked at her with the confusion of a man whose plans had suddenly changed direction. "You're not Thornfield. I am Cordelia Whitmore. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Her voice carried the authority she had used to quiet unruly classrooms. The tone that brooked no argument and accepted no excuses. Blackwood's 2 companions shifted nervously behind him. "The girl isn't yours. She is family. That makes her mine." The word hung in the mountain air with the weight of absolute truth. Family was not always blood. Sometimes it was choice. Sometimes it was the people who saw your worth when the world declared you worthless. "You bring the deed?" Cora held up the papers. "I brought what you asked for. Now show me the girl." Temperance appeared in the cabin doorway, pushed forward by one of Blackwood's men. Her hands were bound, but her eyes burned with unbroken defiance. She had her father's stubborn courage and her own fierce intelligence. The girl's gaze met Cora's across the small clearing. A moment of understanding passed between them. The woman who had come to save her was not the same person who had arrived on the train platform weeks ago. That woman had been seeking shelter. This one was claiming territory. "The deed for the girl," Blackwood said. "Simple transaction." "Nothing about this is simple." Cora stepped closer to the cabin. "You stole from hard-working people. You terrorized families. You kidnapped a child. Those are not business decisions. They are the choices of men who have forgotten how to be human." One of Blackwood's men moved toward his holster. The movement was casual, almost lazy. Men who believed themselves in complete control often made such careless gestures. The shot came from the ridge above them. Not aimed to kill, but to disarm. Tom's rifle spoke with the authority of a man protecting what mattered. The gunman's weapon spun away into the rocks, taking his confidence with it. Suddenly, the camp was surrounded. Ranch hands emerged from concealment with rifles trained on the kidnappers. The trap had been sprung with the precision of the schoolteacher's lesson plan. Blackwood's composure cracked. "You can't prove anything." "We have your partner's confession." Cora's voice remained steady as stone. "Banker Fairweather is very eager to cooperate with the authorities. Men like him always are when they face consequences." The collapse came quickly after that. Men who preyed on the weak rarely possessed the courage to face organized resistance. They surrendered without further violence, their grand scheme reduced to common crime in the harsh light of mountain justice. Cora cut Temperance's bonds with steady hands. The girl fell into her arms with the desperate embrace of someone who had been truly frightened for the first time in her young life. The woman who held her was no longer a stranger seeking acceptance. She was home. Ezekiel found them there, still holding each other in the shadow of the abandoned cabin. His face showed the strain of hours spent imagining loss. When he looked at Cora, his eyes held something that had been missing before: recognition of who she truly was. "You came back. I never left." She smoothed Temperance's hair with gentle hands. "Not really. I just forgot where I belonged." The ride back to the ranch passed in companionable silence. The crisis had burned away the careful politeness that had kept them arm's length. What remained was simpler and stronger. 3 people who had chosen to be family. 6 months later, Cora stood on the same train platform where she had once been abandoned. This time, she was not waiting for rescue. She was offering it. The woman who stepped down from the eastbound train carried herself with the familiar posture of someone who had learned to expect disappointment. 35 years old, and convinced her best years were behind her. Another mail-order bride who had been told she was too old for happiness. Cora approached her with the steady confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world. "Miss Patterson, I am Cordelia Thornfield. Welcome to Silver Creek." The woman's eyes widened with surprise. She had expected judgment or pity. Instead, she found understanding and the promise of possibility. "Age is not what makes us valuable," Cora said quietly. "It is what we have learned along the way. What we choose to do with that knowledge. How we build rather than tear down." Behind them, the ranch spread across the valley in the golden light of late afternoon. Cattle grazed in well-tended pastures. Smoke rose from the chimney of a house that had become a home. Temperance waved from the porch where she sat reading, secure in the love of parents who had chosen each other and her. The mountains watched over it all with the patience of stone and the wisdom of time. Some things endured. Some people found their worth not in youth or beauty, but in the deeper currencies of character and love. Some stories ended not with departure, but with the recognition that home was not a place you found, but something you built with your own hands and heart. The wind carried the scent of coming winter and the promise of spring beyond. Seasons changed, but the essential truths remained. Love was not the privilege of the young. Purpose was not the monopoly of the beautiful. Worth was not measured in years, but in the courage to keep building, keep choosing, keep believing that the best chapters might still be unwritten. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from, perhaps. We will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.